Parliament's intelligence watchdog has described it as persistent and unpredictable. 2 men have been arrested after a car crashed into a care home during a police pursuit, leaving 8 residents in hospital. It happened in Sunderland last night. And women's world number 1, Aryna Sabalenka, is out of Wimbledon in the semi-finals for a third time. She suffered a 3-set defeat to American 13th seed Amanda Anisimova in a hard-fought match on centre court. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 108 points at 89.75. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.16. LBC weather staying warm overnight with clear skies across much of the UK, a low of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. For years, Britain has been waiting for a way of stopping the cross-channel migrant boats that is both effective and humane. Has it finally arrived? The deal announced earlier this evening between Britain and France was never a given. Plenty of expert observers thought it couldn't be negotiated. But here it is, as described by Keir Starmer standing next to President Macron a little earlier on.
For the very first time, migrants arriving via small boat will be detained and returned to France in short order. In exchange for every return, a different individual will be allowed to come here via a safe route, controlled and legal, subject to strict security checks, and only open to those who have not tried to enter the UK illegally.
This does feel like a real step forward, but we can't yet know whether it will actually work, because that depends upon how powerful the psychological deterrent actually is for determined and desperate migrants. The numbers are small to start with. Few great struggles were overcome with a pilot scheme. But the gamble, if you like, is that it'll just make taking the risk of crossing the channel too high. If you've paid smugglers a lot of money to get to Britain, and then you find out you might be sent straight back, do not pass go, then you might have second thoughts. You might look for alternative life options. I don't know. Nobody knows. What I do know is that channel migration has been a running sore in British politics for years, helping to upend almost everything. It has been the subject of passionate argument at Westminster and around the country, at elections and between elections. It's been a big driver of support for Nigel Farage and reform, now, according to the pollsters, Britain's most popular political party. And yet, amid all the political hubbub, the migrant numbers have just kept rising remorselessly. In 2018, 299 people crossed by boat. 5 years later, it was 45,000. This year, we're on track for another record year. As Starmer himself said today, it can't go on like this. In the last 7 years, more than 160,000 people have tried to cross the channel in small boats. But it isn't just about the numbers, or the cost to the taxpayer, or even the danger of the crossing. This is about the complete inability of the British state to do something that voters want it to do. It's about uselessness. And if Keir Starmer fails with his new scheme working with the French, then he and his party will pay a very, very high price. So let's kick off tonight with Mike Tapp, who's the Labour MP for Dover and Deal, and so pretty much on the front line of this. So, Mike, you've heard what the Prime Minister said. Yeah. Are you impressed?
I'm enthused. I'm positive. We've obviously had a tricky challenge here. We did inherit, as you pointed out, really there, pretty much open borders with that massive increase since 2018, and we've got to accept that there's not one bit of policy that will fix this. So you combine it with record deportations, processing up by 50%, the establishment of the Border Security Command, bringing in counter-terror powers, obviously still going through Parliament, and now this deterrent. So if you're sat in Calais, you're thinking £6,000, up to £6,000 to cross, which is expensive, particularly for these people, but hey, I might end up going back, then you might well think twice. And as you pointed out there, we don't really know the impact yet, but I think it's a positive move.
So in a sense, it's Labour's version of the Rwanda scheme. It's meant to be a deterrent. It's meant to make people think twice.
Yeah, deterrents are really important, but it has to be a credible deterrent. And, for going to Rwanda at that cost wasn't credible. But if we can return, high-ish numbers, then it does start creating that. I compared it earlier to, buying a car. And if you're running a business and 1 in 17 of your vehicles you're selling is dodgy, your business model is going to start breaking down. And that's what this will do to the smuggling gang model.
Now, we're talking in the first case, I think, about 50 people a month being sent back. It is very small scale. And as I said earlier on, you don't accomplish a revolution with a pilot scheme. So presumably you want to see this tried and then extended very fast.
Yeah, look, I think this is a testament to that diplomatic effort from Yvette and also Keir Starmer with the French, because we've seen in the past the Conservatives, for example, begging for this and being rejected outright. So we've got it on the table. We're getting it started. It is a pilot, like you said, so we hope it's a success, and I'd like to see it grow larger, yes.
Let me just ask you about the impact in your own constituency, Dover and Deal, looking out across the Channel. I think about 250 people crossed today alone.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed. It used to be that these dinghies would come up onto the beaches and then people would flee, often handing themselves in to get into the system, but often not. Now we know that they are all intercepted because of that improvement in technology, radar, etc. But it's still completely unacceptable where we're at. And a lot of my constituents are worried about the rules being broken. These are hard-working people who don't like seeing almost queue jumping.
It's about competence and sort of fecklessness, and a worry the state can no longer actually control the border at all. So it's a big, big issue for your party.
It is, and I've said it over and over again that we wouldn't accept 30,000 people a year barging through the barriers at Heathrow, and therefore we shouldn't accept illegal entries in our sea borders. And it's really good to see Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper making these changes and implementing this, and also that influence with the French to change their laws around tackling boats in shallow waters. The Germans have changed their laws around procurement of parts.
Did you like it when you saw French police going into the water and actually puncturing the boat so that they couldn't set off?
I did, and there's two sides to that. Firstly, we've got to be firm to protect a border, and it's good to see the French doing that. But also there's a little girl on that boat, and we've seen, kids dying in the Channel, and we may well, or they may well, have saved her lives, and that's because of that diplomacy to have them changing their laws. So it's all positive there.
Let's be absolutely frank and honest between us. Nobody's listening. If you don't get this sorted, your party will lose the election.
I think that obviously we're talking about the threat from reform here. It's a complex threat, and we've got to deliver on the NHS. We're already bringing waiting times down. Get those 13,000 coppers out on the streets. Make sure that the economy does continue to improve, so that people are feeling. It's about feeling it. But we can't deny and we can't hide from the fact that people are voting on immigration, be it net migration, which is obviously coming down, and having order at the border and ensuring that we've got a rules-based system that works. It is very important.
One final point, it was announced today, and there was Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron shoulder to shoulder, and the Prime Minister said he wanted this to happen very, very quickly. It would happen almost immediately, etc. But actually, there are court challenges ahead, both here and in France and at the EU level. This might not happen in the way that it's been promised. That would be a huge kind of embarrassment, even a humiliation for the Prime Minister and the government if this now doesn't actually happen.
Well, let's hope that we push that through, and we're legislators, not lawyers, so we mustn't let the law stand in the way of doing the right thing, and this is the right thing.
Does that suggest that you think the Attorney General has been standing in the way a little bit in recent times?
Absolutely not. No, I think he's a very professional Attorney General, and he gives the right advice. But it is about ensuring that if the law is in the way of doing the right thing, we change it. And a good example of that for me is Article 3 and 8 of the ECHR. Look, if we can't deport a paedophile, there's no way that the public are going to accept that. So we have to look at adjusting to ensure we can.
So you are in favour of working with other European countries to change the ECHR?
I think that's a good start point. It's a complex issue, that, because of the number of signatories.
You know where
there.
I'm going.
I know where you're going.
If you can't change it, should we leave it?
No. I think there's too much trade deals. The Belfast Agreement.
Even if it means we can't deport paedophiles?
The trade. Look at the trade deals that were underpinned by the ECHR and the Belfast Agreement. Denmark have managed to use their domestic laws to ensure that it's fit for purpose, and I think that's what we can do too.
All right, Mike Tapp, thank you very, very much for coming in and talking
Pleasure,
to me.
Thank you.
And now to Lord Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor and also our former ambassador in Paris. Peter, very good to have you on the show again. What did you make of this agreement? Lots and lots of warm words on both sides, but do you think this is one that will stick? Because, as I said just now, lots of legal challenges too.
There are indeed, Andrew. Could I just first of all take exception with your statistics at the beginning? Yes, the numbers of small boat crossings have gone up, but when I was ambassador in 2015, there were thousands of migrants jumping on lorries and hiding in camper vans and jumping on trains. So this has been going on for almost 2 decades, really, since David Blunkett closed down the Songat camp in the early 2000s. And this is a step forward, definitely. I mean, you can say a breakthrough. British governments, ever since we left the EU, have been trying to persuade France to adopt a returns policy. This is the first time they've done it. It's not going to be a night and day change to the position because it's only going to be small, even if it builds up beyond the initial pilot scheme. But it is certainly something the government's wanted to do. As you rightly say, it is not a done deal yet. I've been squirreling in the detail of the written declaration they put out, and there's quite a significant sentence that says it'll be finalised subject to completing prior legal scrutiny in full transparency and understanding with the Commission and EU member states. And we know that quite a lot of EU member states have got a problem. So there's still a hoop to be jumped through by the French with the EU and conceivably also legal challenges, as you were saying, in the UK. So I don't think it's for sure that they're going to start very quickly, but it is an important signal of determination by the two of them, the determination they've been communicating, transmitting all the way through this summit. And so, we've certainly had a step forward here.
That was a very important point you raised just now about the other European countries, particularly the Mediterranean southern countries. Can you remind people listening why they might have a problem with this deal?
Well, first of all, this is, of course, a much wider problem than just the UK. We have the numbers you've been talking about, but countries of the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, Spain, they have hundreds of thousands of migrants arriving across the Mediterranean. France, I think, gets over 100,000 a year as well. So this is part of a wider problem. And I think what the Southern Europeans are worried about is if the idea starts that you can return migrants to the country they've come from, well, quite soon EU member states will be trying to return tens of thousands of migrants to Italy, Greece and Spain. And so you can understand that they are worried about that. They think they already take, a far greater share of the burden than they should, and they see this as a slippery slope.
But one of the points you hear from some of the Mediterranean countries, and indeed from President Macron, is that an awful lot of the people arriving in the southern borders of Europe are indeed heading for Britain because we have a system, an economy and a legal system which makes it relatively easy to find work in the black market or the grey market and get access to housing and free healthcare and the rest of it. And when President Macron said quite openly to Keir Starmer, do you know what, you guys have got to get your house in order. You've got to be less of a magnet for migration. Do you think he had a point, and do you think this is a big issue for the British government?
Again, it's not a new point. It's been the, what migrants say, the myth, if you like, that you get to a kind of El Dorado if you can cross the channel to the UK. Partly it's about language. They find it easier, I think, to integrate into an English-speaking country. Partly because there isn't the mandatory ID card system. And yes, there is the idea that the black market is easier to get into. You can disappear into the undergrowth in London and work. Now, whether or not that's true, that is certainly what I think has gone down the social media lines in the migrant routings, and British governments have been trying to get ahead of that and have never been able to do so. So this is part of beginning to show, I think, that Britain is a much tougher country for migrants to get to, and even if you get to, you might find yourself being deported from. And so, yes, the messaging is important here, perhaps, as the actual numbers being returned.
a very important moment nonetheless. Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Coming up, another blow to the Conservatives as their former party chair defects to reform. But their leader has come out fighting. More about that next. Time now, 6:15.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
So we don't know how many and we don't know the cost.
Straight to the point.
Tell you what they're laughing at, those two. They're laughing at the law and we're letting them.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Inexcusable, shambolic failure.
Listen on Global Player or the new LBC app. Download it now from your app store. LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:17. Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, came out fighting today after losing another member of her party, the former chairman, Jake Berry, no less, to her deadly rivals at Reform. She was ripping into the cost of benefits. Britain, she said, was becoming a welfare state with an economy attached. 28 million people in Britain are now working to pay the wages and benefits of 28 million others. The rider is as big as the horse. She went on to make some good points about some groups she thought shouldn't be getting sickness benefits, which Labour hasn't been clear about. And yet, the day was overshadowed by the Berry defection, and Badenoch, asked about Nigel Farage, did not try to disguise her contempt. Her reference to the cap here is the two-child benefit cap, which she says Reform would lift.
And if there are people who are not Conservatives, people who have probably been holding us back for a long time, then they should go to other parties that fit in with their values. Nigel Farage is committed to remove the cap, and he is warning that he is not finished yet on benefits giveaways. Make no mistake, he is Jeremy Corbyn with a pint and a cigarette.
Well, let's get the reaction to that jibe with Tim Montgomerie, founder of Conservative Home, which online more or less does what it says on the tin, but he has since stepped back and defected to Reform. Tim, very good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Kemi Badenoch's got lots and lots of qualities, but she can be a bit excessively spiky, and I think sort of dismissing Jake Berry in that way was not necessarily clever.
Look, I think the significance of Jake Berry is that it's not just Jake Berry. Jake Berry works, as you all know, Andrew, for Mark Fulbrook. Mark Fulbrook will not be a name that perhaps is known to a lot of listeners, but Mark Fulbrook and Linton Crosby have been at the heart of the Tory election success.
They're the great strategists of the Tory party, yeah.
So I'm generally of the view that if you're an outsider party, keep taking defections from people like me and, you know, people who've been part of the mainstream isn't necessarily a good look. So the defection of Jake Berry doesn't matter so much because of who he is, although he is a former Tory chairman, he's certainly not insignificant. It's the fact that he's connected with this electoral operation. That's
really interesting. I mean, he understands how to run things as well. Reform, with all greatest respect, needs people who can run big parties and big organisations at the moment.
Absolutely. I defected to Reform last November, and my honest view, just between ourselves, as always, is that Nigel Farage has impressed me more than I expected to be impressed. He really is a consummate politician. Reform has impressed me less. It is an operation that needs organisation and administration. Someone like Jake Berry, someone like Mark Fulbrook, brings that to reform. That, I think, is the significance of what we saw last night.
That's very, very interesting. And talking to, I'm sure you do as well, talking to the pollsters who underpin and inform the big political parties, they are increasingly saying they don't really see a way back for the Conservatives at the moment.
Well, look, one thing I've learned in politics recently is not to make too many predictions. But if I sold you a car and on the motorway that car broke down, the wheels fell off, before I sold you a new car, you'd want to know why the old one broke down.
You'd have to come and meet me in A&E first.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. What the Conservative Party has failed to do is explain why the last 14 years of Conservative government were so much poorer, so much less effective than the 18 years that I grew up with Thatcher and Major. The fact is the Conservative Party did everything they said they wouldn't and didn't do the things that they said they would. Until Kemi Badenoch, till any Conservative comes forward and explains why the government failed so comprehensively, gives us an account of why the car did not work, why would we buy another one from them? So I'm very sceptical about the Conservative Party's chances, but I'd never say never.
Very, very briefly, is Robert Jenrick the coming man for the Conservatives?
I would be very surprised if Robert Jenrick is not Conservative leader by the end of the year.
Fascinating. All right, well, Tim, we'll be keeping an eye on that, and I'll remind you whether you're right or whether you're wrong. Thank you very much indeed. Now, another big part of today's British-French summit was the new nuclear deal, coordinating the UK and the French nuclear deterrence, with a joint nuclear supervisory group, something that has never happened before. There was much more about the so-called coalition of the willing to help Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, although there is absolutely no sign of that. But is the new military alliance a weakening, in some sense, of the relationship between the US and France? Because France has always been much more sceptical about NATO. And how much further could this military alliance between us and the French go? Let's find out more from General Dominique Trinquand, the former head of the French military mission to NATO. I wanted to hear his thoughts on the significance of this pact between our two countries.
This is very important if you take in perspective the threat, which is a threat against Europe. And of course, UK and France are the only power in Europe who have the nuclear power. So they have to talk together and to see what to do. And apparently now they are trying to coordinate their nuclear deterrence, which obviously is different in France and in UK. Difference in technical terms, because in UK it's only submarines. In France you've got submarines and aircraft, but I understand that the UK wants to have aircraft too, so this will be in the future. The second point, which is a bit different, is that a nuclear deterrence in France is only French. I mean, there is no other partner, as in UK. They are the US, of course.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because France has historically been much more sceptical about the American aspect of NATO. Do you think that this agreement, as it were, pulls Britain a little bit away from the Trump administration and away from the United States and back towards Europe?
I don't think that it will take UK far from US, but closer from Europe, certainly. I mean that all Europeans currently are a bit afraid of what's happening in the US and about what Mr. Trump could do. But that doesn't mean that the Europeans want to be separated from the US. And UK, of course, is very close from the US. But we have to prepare in case of the US will change his mind and will be far from Europe. So Europe needs to be prepared, and that's what UK and France are doing.
I grew up in a pretty peaceful period during which, in terms of Europe, it was really the French-German alliance that was absolutely central. In the caricature of France leading politically and Germany leading economically. Do you think that because of the Ukraine war, that is beginning to change? And although we're outside the EU, the British-French relationship becomes more and more important?
I think the British-French relation is very important. That always been important, but have a different stage. Currently, with the crisis in Ukraine, I think we are probably more ready than the others. But we need to organize things with in fact, you've got four major military power in Europe, which is UK, France, Germany, which will increase drastically its budget, but also Poland, which is on the border of Ukraine. So I think all these 4 countries need to reorganize themselves to work together. But because of the history, of course, UK and France can work closer and quicker, probably.
And part of the recent agreement between the two countries, and indeed between the UK and Brussels, was to give British defence companies access to the great big European defence spending that's coming forward. It's been said that will be, in fact, quite difficult. Quite a lot of, French companies won't want British competition inside the EU coming in, and it's a nice thing for politicians to say, but in practical terms, the big British defence companies may still find it very hard.
I think it's normal. I mean, you've got the political side and the company side, the industrial sides. And the industries, of course, don't want to have too much competition. But look, MBDA is a French and British company, and we've got no problem with that. And the President and the Prime Minister decided to relaunch the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, which is a big success. So I think that, of course, companies are cautious about the new arrival in the industry horizon, but I think this will work certainly.
You mentioned Storm Shadow there, General, and of course that's been very important for the defence of Ukraine in the war with Russia. What's your perception as a military man of where things are in that war at the moment? There has been a sense that perhaps the Russians are pushing forward a bit more successfully than they have for a long time?
I think that the situation is very difficult for the Ukrainian. They fight, they are defending their country, but after 3 years of war, they've got a problem of personnel, of soldier, but also of a weapon system. And the position of Mr. Trump was not helping in that matter. I know that now he's deciding to put more shells, but in fact, the big difficulty for the Ukrainian is air defense. They need Patriots. And because the Ukrainian on the front line are maintaining the defense. But the problem is that currently the Russians are striking the population. And as you know, a defense is not possible if the population is not maintaining the defense. And so that's why it is difficult for Ukraine. But I think that Mr. Trump was too hard with Mr. Putin, was too hard with Mr. Trump. And at the end, Mr. Trump is discovering that he will not achieve anything with Mr. Putin. So probably he's slowly changing his mind. I hope so anyway.
And Kiev must hope that it's more quickly than slowly at the moment. General Trinquand, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC. A year after the great election victory, bloodied by a successful rebellion over welfare and yet still sneered at in the media as overly loyal stormtroopers, Labour MPs are starting to form their own groups to put pressure on the government. More than 100 of them have just set up the biggest, the Living Standards Group, to persuade ministers to spend more time thinking about everyday issues such as food, energy, childcare and housing. One of the new intake of backbenchers spearheading the group is Yuan, the Labour MP for Earley and Woodley, and she joins me now. Yuan, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. What was it that spurred you to get involved in this new group?
So I think this coalition is a really important coalition for putting the focus squarely on living standards, which is where it should be. My constituency of Earley and Woodley is one of the relatively affluent, fast-growing parts of the country here in Reading. But what unites all of the MPs involved in this group, what unites the over 100 of us involved in this coalition, is that whether we're from the red wall seats or new southern seats, that all of our constituents are really feeling the squeeze from the cost of living crisis the last few years. And I think there's quite a broad consensus across the Parliamentary Labour Party that that should be the focus of our government.
But if I was the Chancellor and said to you, Yuan, that's all very interesting, but there's very, very little I can do in the short term, what would you say to me?
think there's a lot that can be done in the short term, and there's a lot the government is already doing in terms of improving the cost of living for working families. For example, the free school meals and breakfast clubs offers do all exactly that. They will be kicking into force already. But the crucial test, I think, of many of the policy proposals that this coalition is going to be putting forward is that they are fiscally neutral, that they benefit middle and low income households, the ones who've been losing out, and that they're also growth enhancing. So I don't think that comes into conflict with what the Chancellor is doing at all.
That's really interesting. So give people listening just a few examples of what you're talking about.
There's a lot that we're still discussing in terms of further offers on childcare, on energy costs, on grocery and the cost of the supermarket shop. And all of this we're working out with colleagues. And so we're aiming to be constructive, to put forward proposals that can be feasible, but importantly, proposals that can actually change the cost of living facing our residents.
So it's early days yet, I get that. But do you think the government could or should intervene, for instance, with the big supermarket chains to ensure that there are levels of basic foodstuffs at a certain price to ensure that everyone can get access to the basics of bread and milk and fruit and vegetables?
Well, I think what Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, is doing in terms of his work with supermarkets, in terms of increasing the options for nutrition to shoppers, is already really, really interesting. We'd want to be building on work like that. But we're in the development phase of these kinds of policies. And when we start coming out with policies, I'd love to talk to you further about them in detail, Andrew.
And I would love to hear you when you can, Yuan Yang. Thank you very much indeed for coming on. Now then, a parliamentary committee report has found that the danger Iran poses to Britain is now as bad as that Russia poses. I'll be asking the committee chair how worried we should all be about the rising threat. The time now 6:31, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
A former UK ambassador to France has told LBC the first deal between the two countries to return migrants won't be a case of night and day. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, Lord Peter Ricketts also says it's likely to face legal challenges. A 17-year-old boy is one of 3 teenagers arrested over major cyber attacks on various retailers earlier this year. A 20-year-old woman was also detained after Marks & Spencer, the Co-op and Harrods were hacked in April and May. And detectives are investigating reports a man was stabbed to death outside a luxury hotel in central London as part of a robbery. The 24-year-old was killed outside the Park Tower Hotel in Knightsbridge last night. LBC weather staying warm overnight with clear skies across much of the UK, a low of 10 degrees.
LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:34. Now, agents from Iran are at least as dangerous today inside Britain as Russian spies, according to Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee today. The Iranians are apparently very well resourced and keen to cause mayhem, using the threat of assassination, violence, cyber attacks and physical threats against both Iranian dissidents and pro-Jewish and Israeli interests. Iran's intelligence services were, and I'm quoting, willing and able, often through third-party agents, to attempt assassinations within the UK and kidnaps from the UK. The chairman of the committee, Lord Beamish, also says that Iran's intelligence services have a high appetite for risk, which sounds alarming. How worried should ordinary folk like you and me really be?
I think what the report shows is that Iran is both, in their threat to the UK, it's widespread, it's persistent, but it's also risky in the sense that they are targeting individuals here and distant others travelling abroad, and using proxies to do it. And that's the difference in terms of the recklessness of some of this action.
So they're going to petty criminals, small-time criminals. Here's a wodge of money. Go and beat up that person, or indeed go and burn that building, go and assassinate that person.
There's that, but also there's the more organised killings, for example, that took place in both the Netherlands a few years ago and in Turkey, where organised crime gangs related to drugs in this case sadly were successful in killing 4 people. And they're aiming at dissidents or people who criticise the regime, Israeli targets, and also the Jewish community.
So specific prominent Jewish organisations and people are at risk from the Iranians?
Well, yeah, it's in. I think one of our witnesses said that anti-Israel and anti-Jewish is in the DNA of the strategy of the Iranians, and the difference, I think, in terms of I think we refer to it. They're not. They're top of the championship. They're not in the Premier League like Russia and China. But the difference is their appetite for risk is higher.
Just explain a bit more about that. That was a sort of chilling phrase I came across, and I was...
Well, what it is that in terms of I think it's now 20 plots that have been thwarted by the security services and police, targeting named individuals, and that's both physical harm to those individuals and property as well related to it. And is that being carried out directly by Iranians? No, it's being subcontracted to people who... level of violence for in some cases, military return, shows no boundaries. So that's how dangerous it is.
Let me ask about the individuals concerned who are Iranian, because we've got a very big Iranian community in this country, kind of overwhelmingly anti-regime, of course, dissidents, as it were. But are you concerned that in that large community and threatening that community, there are Iranian agents hiding?
Well, I think the security are very good at targeting the direct agents, but what you're doing, if you're doing it through subcontraction, basically, their strategy is to target not only dissidents, but also even critics, academics who, for example, who write critically of Iran, and also certainly some of the diaspora here who've got family in Iran still. Those individuals in Iran and family members come under a lot of pressure to put pressure on individuals back here.
3 very young men were found guilty of setting a fire to a warehouse yesterday. Is that the kind of is that a good example of the kind of thing we're talking about? Well, young criminals just given something to do, go off and do it.
There is that, but then there's the organised attempts which we've seen against named individuals threatening to stab, or, as I say, also in Europe where it's been successfully in terms of people being killed. So it's a different, there are different levels of, but it's intimidation and trying to target those individuals.
Reading what the Iranians have been up to, it's very hard to understand why the Revolutionary Guards Corps has not been banned in this country yet. Do you understand why?
Yeah, I do. The problem is the prescription comes under the 2000 Terrorism Act. There is no element of that which actually allows you to prescribe a state entity, which ISGC is. I think the government are currently looking at that.
That seems daft, if I may say so.
It does, but that's the current position. And people compare it with the Americans. The Americans' law is very different. The other point to it is, well, we've got to also recognise that there'll be political fallout from this, or diplomatic fallout, on the basis that I think something like a quarter of the cabinet of Iran are actually members of the RGC or got connections to it. So you've got to balance that with, what we actually achieve in practice. That's not to say that, sanctions haven't been in place on certain named individuals connected to the IRGC.
It just does seem a bit odd. You mentioned the Americans there. In the United States, there's a lot of worry about Iranian sleeper cells all around the US. That doesn't appear in your report, though you mention Lebanese Hezbollah as potentially having some kind of sleeper arrangements here?
Oh, well, yeah, there was evidence that's in the report that Hezbollah tried to, and it was disruptive, thankfully, tried to import precursor chemicals into the UK. And again, it's part of...
Precursor chemicals
for explosives.
Right.
And, it's part of the strategy of Iran. Well, what they do is, which they do certainly in the Middle East by working through proxies and other organisations such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda and others, so they can deny any involvement. But there's well-documented open source material that they supply these organisations.
This report is, as you said, historic, as it were. It's a bit out of date. Have things got worse since then? And in particular, have the kind of the intense sort of anger around the country about Gaza and Palestine, has that made it easier for the Iranians?
Well, that could, but I would say that we finished our ours in 2023 and the general elections held the report up, but the fundamentals haven't changed. The idea that the Iranians want to protect their regime, that's the key point. They will use any elements to do that, including the assassination, kidnapping and destabilisation through cyber attacks and other things. Hasn't changed.
Lord Beamish, thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to LBC.
Thank you.
Now then, we're all pretty familiar with the huge numbers of job losses in traditional businesses all across Britain in recent decades, and the way big chunks of the country, particularly the English Midlands and North, have been devastated by industrial decline. The angry political backlash to that is well understood. But what about the next big industrial revolution, artificial intelligence or AI? The research company Focaldata has been studying which jobs are most at risk and where in the country they are found. And the short answer is that it's all the white-collar jobs that are likely to be shredded, the management consultants, the business analysts, the accountants, the market researchers. Let's hear now from James Kanagasooriam, Focaldata's Chief Research Officer. James, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. So I've listed some of the jobs there, and I think your own job is among those most at risk from AI, you note. But where in the country are these jobs congregated?
So I think the first thing that came out from the research is the concentration really around London. When we were analysing the kind of top 5, 6, 7, 8 seats where there are basically a high proportion of skilled white-collar jobs that could be automated, there were basically areas like Highgate in North London, Hampstead, Richmond Park in southwest London, Chelsea and Fulham, parts of Kensington. We're really talking about some of the most affluent parts of Britain, but also ones where there are lots of university graduates, fairly high rates of home ownership. But obviously you'll notice there's a political lean. Those are pretty much some of the most heavily Remain areas from the 2016 referendum. So the idea that this kind of new, as it were, left behind, or what we call executive Britain, is about to be in for quite a potentially tricky decade as this kind of rolls in.
They started off by coming for the Brexiteers and the Red Wall seats, and now they're coming for the Remainers. Are you convinced that this AI revolution is going to have the same kind of social and economic impact as previous ones?
I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, my piece kind of dwelt on the downsides. There will, of course, be upsides. But if I was to compare it, for example, to the situation in the Red Wall, which was, by coincidence, the phrase that I coined 7 years ago in the analysis, it looks like basically things could happen quite quickly. Post-industrialisation and movements happened over decades. The impact took 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I think what we can see from the milk round in terms of white-collar graduate jobs is the numbers of openings that occur are actually down by double digits. And as a cohort, that's going to roll through extremely quickly. And it's all so geographically concentrated that by the next election, the politics of AI in artificial intelligence, I mean, what I should say is I work at a market research company that uses that. We're one of the first companies to basically deploy that. So, from our extent, we are very much tip of the change to come. There will be winners from this, but I think the winners
a
and
lot
losers
of very quick losers. And the losers will find out pretty quickly. And they include, by the way, a lot of programmers, a lot of people inside the computing world as well. Again, I suspect, clustered in those more affluent places. So we could begin to see a new kind of political revolution or turmoil happening of a very different nature. Impossible to say at this stage exactly what form that would take. But if there's lots and lots of very, very angry people in what were comfortable, easy parts of the country, then we're heading for more political turbulence in the UK, not less. Question mark.
Yeah.
Big question mark.
Big question mark. I mean, the thing that's really struck me is that because it's literally the opposite areas, we looked at the areas that were least likely to have jobs, which were exposed to AI, and they are, of course, almost all heavily Brexit and what we would call left behind areas on the east coast of England, and Boston, Skegness, bits of Hull, areas that have had a lot of focus politically over the last 10 years. It might have the capacity just to equalise the sense of what's left behind. And I think it also means that in Britain it's becoming harder and harder to not see groups that aren't losing out in some way, whether that's jobs, wealth, education, income, job security, cultural power. It seems that different groups can be doing well on one axis, but not so well on the other.
Yeah.
And so
that is a new thing, a situation where there's nobody who isn't affected, nobody who is, as it were, secure and safe.
And I think that's why our politics is currently so pessimistic, because when you kind of add up the scorecard of life, almost everyone can find at least one dimension on which there's some kind of threat to security. And so I really think this will have a potential for quite a large-scale disruption to British politics.
Not a cheerful conversation, James, but an important one. Thank you very much indeed for it. After another jam-packed news week, I'm going to be joined by my expert political panel next. Time now, 6:46.
Coming up at 7, Ian Dale leading Britain's conversation. Next on LBC. This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
6:48. It's been a week dominated by the French president's state visit, but don't be fooled. There has been a hell of a lot more going on than that politically, with high-profile defections to reform, harsh words from the health secretary about further doctors' strikes, and much more besides. So it's a good thing I've got not one, not two, but three panellists with me today to break it all down. The Guardian columnist, Polly Toynbee, the deputy political editor of The Spectator, James Heale, and our very own political editor, Natasha Clark. Welcome to you all. Can I start, perhaps arrogantly, with what I was saying yesterday, which is that it seems to me it's been a week, you may all disagree, where we've had so many demands for extra spending, a lot of extra money for the junior doctors, more money for the court system, and on and on and on, and yet everybody's determined that taxes must not go up anywhere. And given that we can't borrow much more money, it just seems to me there's a kind of political fantasy that we've all been indulging. It's not just one party, it's everybody, more or less. What do you make of that? James, do you want to start?
I completely agree with that. I think that what we're seeing now is an accelerated form of what we've had for basically the post-2008 generation, which is that ultimately our productivity has skewed to sort of 0.2% gains each year. You're seeing less bang for the buck in terms of the money we're putting into the public service. And I do think there's a sense of the economy not growing enough to sort of fund extra additional revenue. So I think all parties are really struggling with the fact that there's what happens when you have not much economic growth. The politics becomes much more visceral, and that's why you see so much fragmentation, lots of sort of electoral uncertainty, and a very angry and unhappy public.
And with that angry public, Polly, nobody levels with us. Nobody gives it to us straight.
The one person who does, Paul Johnson, head of the IFS, had his last day yesterday. And as he left in a state of teeth-grinding frustration, saying that, on the left it's magic money trees, raise taxes from the rich, wealth taxes. And on the right it's the magic Laffer curve, which is a nonsensical bit of stuff that says that if you cut taxes more, you get more money in, which absolutely not true. Proven, I think Liz Truss proved the case, really. So it is very difficult. Everybody needs more money. As you say, every single department is absolutely desperate. And, after the years of austerity, after the stagnation since the bankers' crash, there just isn't more money around. We are a poorer country and we haven't faced up to it. Nobody tells us quite what gives us that basic truth. So, Natasha, Chancellor of the Exchequer, lying on her lilo or her beach or wherever she lies over the summer, she has some very hard choices whether she gets time off or not.
She does, and that's going to be really tricky. It's going to be a really tricky summer for the Chancellor, just filled with tax speculation about where she might go. And actually, I've been told by a couple of MPs this week that she's basically asking and welcoming MPs' suggestions on where she can go with taxes. And I think, to be honest with you, that might be a good idea, because I imagine she's scratching her head going, where on earth can I go now? And of course, they've ruled out the three big ones, so that leaves her with such a small pot to look at. And I was really struck by that OBR report that we were talking about earlier this week, Andrew. So doom and gloom. The economy is in such a pit. And we now, I think, need to start looking at even more difficult decisions. And earlier with the welfare rebellion last week, what it really showed is that actually Keir Starmer is in a very weak position to be able to take some of these really big decisions. If he can't take decisions like this on welfare, how on earth is he going to look again at the things like the triple lock, which need to be looked at again, because the sustainability of them in the future, the sustainability of public sector pensions, it's not going to last forever. And
that triple lock is going to have to go at some point. I'm sure about that. But
very helpful for them today that Kemi Badenoch actually said that herself, that she was, not going to guarantee it, and that really helps if the opposition is in that place.
Very, very few people are listening to her, but I have to say that I thought Kemi Badenoch's speech was quite good today, in the sense she was talking about the huge growth in benefits, and she said the rider has got as big as the horse. And then she started to say some of the conditions which she thought you shouldn't get disability benefits from, which was quite bold of her. The problem is, of course, James, that she's being overshadowed by yet another defection, this time Jake Berry, ex-MP, ex-chairman of the Conservative Party.
Well, yes, and the leader of the opposition's office have had advice which suggests that no one's going to listen to the Conservatives for 2 years until after the election. So they've still got another sort of 12 months of pain, perhaps, to soak up, shouting into the voice and the abyss before anyone actually listens to them. I think that it's clearly this issue we've seen in British politics, which is that sort of personalities rather than issues often dominate. She's obviously finding that quite hard. She's quite a serious person. She takes her politics very seriously. I think, as you say, she is trying to think hard about some of these solutions. The problem is she's coming up against her party's legacy and also against a right-wing insurgent in terms of Reform UK, which Margaret Thatcher didn't have in the 70s.
I'm very, very interested in that. Tim Montgomerie was sitting in that very chair a little while ago, and he said to me he was pretty sure that Robert Jenrick would be the Conservative leader by the end of this year, which is interesting. What do you think, Natasha?
Well, people are already talking in the Conservative Party about when Kemi Badenoch goes, and I think that those rumblings have definitely grown in the recent weeks, because there's a lot of talk of, well, actually, if we do wait until next summer after the Scottish and Welsh elections, which are widely expected to be poor for the Conservatives, is that going to make things worse? And I think, with every passing sort of day, week and month, there are more Tories going, how much more of this can we take? She, of course, can't face a leadership challenge until November at the earliest, but it's going to be a very difficult conference season for her going into it, if indeed she's going into it right now, with not the support of her party, not the support in the polls, and very, very few policy offerings to point to as well.
And Robert Jenrick absolutely, obviously on manoeuvres every single day.
Yep. But if he's the answer, what was the question? He is so close to reform in all of his attitudes that there is this huge space where traditional conservatism ought to be and needs to be for the sake of the country. There are plenty of people who can be brought back who maybe voted Lib Dem or didn't vote last time. But you need a decent, old-fashioned Conservative Party that is not reform and will fight reform. They need someone like James Cleverly.
And, well, they're not going to get someone like James Cleverly, I strongly suspect. I agree with you, actually, but I don't think it's going to happen. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of pollsters saying there is no way back for the Conservatives, and at the same time, as we saw today, the big immigration story, migration totally dominates British politics at the moment. Keir Starmer has done, what is an interesting deal in the sense, James, lots of people in the media from all across things saying this is not a deal that they're going to be able to get across the line. It's not really, it won't happen. Well, it kind of has happened. There's still legal challenges to go, but it's a pilot scheme. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it's a good small step, and it's better than nothing. It's the kind of thing that you'd have seen Rishi Sunak pushing for as well. They really wanted this. I was talking to someone in the Sunak government earlier who's saying, they really will try to put a lot of effort into this. So it's a credit to Keir Starmer for getting this across. I just don't think it's going to make a huge dent in the numbers. The Tories will say actually it's 17 in, 1 out, which is the sense of it's only a very small number of being affected. But to go back to the point you were just making there as well, the reason why we're seeing migration becoming such a huge issue across politics is because it's a battle for resources. There's less and less money to go around, and that's why you see reform and the Tories as well leaning into this kind of immigrant versus native approach as there's less money to sort of go around. So I do think it's going to be an important step today. Will it actually stop the boats? It'll stop some boats, but not all of them by any means.
And it's all about the optics, as they always say. Let me ask finally about Keir Starmer himself, because he had an absolutely bloody week last week. It was terrible for him. And I am beginning to pick up people muttering about his future, whether he can make it through next year, particularly if the Labour Party gets battered by reform in the Welsh elections, perhaps the Scottish elections, the London borough elections and borough elections around the country.
Labour doesn't throw people out. It doesn't throw its leaders out, particularly not when in power, never has. I don't think there's any possibility of that. Part of the reason, of course, is that, like all parties are split between right and left, who would take over? Both sides would be afraid that the other side, will it be Angela Rayner? Would it be somebody to the right? And in the end, they will settle for what they've got. And he is a thoroughly decent man and clever, and he may lack certain political talents, but so did Attlee. What matters is whether they can actually come up with some more exciting policies, because frankly their policies so far have failed to ignite much enthusiasm.
He is a thoroughly decent man, but he's also got a kind of quiet contempt for what we call politics, including explaining himself and really getting some kind of emotional connection with voters. I'd be very interested, Natasha, first of all, your view on where he's got to.
Yeah, I think he'll be a little less bruised than he was last week, and I don't think that's quite easy to say that, because last week was obviously very bruising for the Prime Minister. Is he going to be facing any form of imminent leadership challenge? Obviously unlikely. I think a lot of the people I speak to in government just say, look, we are prepared for this. We knew that coming into government was going to be difficult decisions right at the front. We deliberately made those decisions. We are prepared to accept that. There is a way, I spoke to some normal people at the weekend, and they really summed it up as, one person said, 1 year of Keir Starmer, they've, upset absolutely everybody. And the other person turned to them and said, well, they've got 4 years to go. So, that really, I think, sums it up. It has been a poor year for Sir Keir Starmer, but they have so far to go. And I genuinely don't feel that there are Labour MPs that are worried about his position at the moment.
And is that the real lesson, James? We all have to calm down. Politics moves very, very fast. There are 4 years to go, and Labour still has a stonking, huge majority.
Yeah, of course. I think long term, there's quite a sort of bullish case to make for Labour getting through the next 4 years or so with the right split if it continues to be that way. But I'm just surprised by how he seems almost at times to be cracking up. Two of those 3 interviews he gave the Prime Minister, into the New Statesman, Observer and Sunday Times, he was almost weeping. And I thought he's not enjoying it. He can have a contempt for politics, but this is the business we've chosen, to quote Hyman Roth. He's in this game, and I think the medium term is going to be very difficult for him.
It's very weird. He does enjoy being Prime Minister, however.
You can see him stuff.
I think he enjoys parts of it, doesn't he? He enjoys the statesman-like stuff, the world stage. But does he agree? Does he enjoy the politics? I think you're right. I don't think so.
He enjoys those things he thinks that matter.
Indeed. All right, well, listen, we've run out of time. Someone's shouting in our ears saying you've got to stop now. So thank you all very, very much. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. Download it for free from your app store, coming up at 10 on LBC. Ben Kendish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. It was a much-hyped announcement, Macron and Starmer, on how to solve the small boats crisis. But did it amount to more than a hill of beans? I'm afraid it doesn't seem like it. The only vaguely substantial announcement was a curious one-in, one-out scheme. But rumour is it will be a maximum of 50 people a week. Just wow. A year after Labour came to power, the number of people crossing the Channel has risen by nearly half. Much more of this, and Nigel Farage will walk straight into number 10. Radio presenter Rich Clark joins me to discuss why, even in